And so we continue our look at Khrushchev's rule in the Soviet Union, his economic policies, more specifically, the industrial. All right, so the learning objectives remain the same. Here we're going to look at the ways that Khrushchev is going to attempt to reform the industry of the Soviet Union. And I want you to try to understand the successes and the failures of the policies and why they succeeded or failed. And then, of course, compare and contrast the policies of Stalin with those of Khrushchev. And away we go! Industry. So when we're talking about the industry, one of the things that we need to recognize is that historically, throughout this entire time period, the industrial sector of the economy has always outperformed agriculture. And Khrushchev recognized that there were inefficiencies and problems with the system, and he tried to address those and kind of fix them, but in many respects, he was unsuccessful. But overall, the growth in the industrial sector of the economy continued despite the mucking about that Khrushchev did. And so when he comes to power, and the thing that we kind of have to really remember about Khrushchev is he sincerely believed in the might of the Soviet Union. He sincerely believed in the rightness of communism. He truly believed in the ideology. And so again, he's thinking that all the potential is there. What we need to do is just fix the inefficiencies and the problems in the system, and then the Soviet Union will leapfrog over anything that the West has. So Khrushchev said about the Soviet Union to the West, "We will bury you." Just like that, like he was Darth Vader, except different because he was like Russian and didn't wear a black mask. Anyway, but we know with the benefits of hindsight that these problems of the economy occurred as a result of the communist system. The communist system was not really responsive to a lot of things that were going on. One of the things that we can say is that the economy was overly centralized. This means that the control and the decision-making about the economy was located in Moscow. And they, of course, are unable to respond to local conditions. And as time has gone on, there is increasing confusion as to how to manage an economy as it becomes more complex. It actually was okay in terms of having centralized decision-making back in the beginning to jumpstart the economy, and when things were relatively simple. Inputs, outputs, sort of like reactions, relatively simple. As the economy grew, as the Soviet Union grew, and especially now when you start throwing in the complexities of the satellite states, you have this really, really unwieldy and incredibly complex system with so many different strands in it, and people don't know how to direct it. The other thing that's happening is in a Marxist system, in Marxist ideology, the only thing that has value is human labor. So if the only thing that's valuable is the work that people do, then how do you allocate resources that are scarce? If you have a resource that is a limiting factor, but you have all of this labor, where do you put that resource in order to get the most out of it? Marxism, communism had no answer. And the thing that would have really answered that or directed where to put scarce resources is the market. There is no market force to drive production. What could they use as an indicator to figure out where resources were supposed to be allocated and how much was supposed to be produced? So without profit, what do you use as an indicator of success? the economists and the managers had difficulty with this. So the result is that they would set these sort of quotas, and that would lead the managers of factories to attain them in irrational ways, right? It's because these managers are not going to receive bonuses. There's no profit, no reason for them to work extra hard. And they try to encourage the planners to set the targets super low so that they could meet them with very little push. If the planners set a target for like 5,000 kilos of nails, then instead of making a variety of nail sizes depending on the uses, they would make as few nails as possible, as heavy as possible, so that they would meet the quota. But there was no rational use of what they produced. So I got a little ahead of myself. I was just having too good of a time talking about the economy. So that means that, as said previously, we have some difficulty deciding what can be used to indicate success in the economy. And managers of factories were motivated to meet specific targets. So since they couldn't decide on what would tell them they were being successful, they had to pick somewhat arbitrary numbers. And the managers would meet these specific targets, but they would persuade the planners to implement low targets, basically telling them, hey, man, the factories can only do this, and so on and so forth. These managers were also quite suspicious of innovation, so they weren't willing to experiment and try new things, because that innovation, it's like, hey, man, this is the way we've always done things. Why do that? And they were afraid that maybe, if these innovations didn't work, they would lose their positions. They would be blamed for failures. Maybe they were also scared that it would provide more work for them to do. And there is no personal reason, nothing to motivate them to implement these. The old system was working just fine. They just kept on going with it. So these, as we said, these planning figures, these arbitrarily chosen numbers, resulted in irrational incentives. So people would be motivated to just finish instead of finishing well. You want 5,000 pairs of shoes? We'll give you 5,000 pairs of shoes. Sadly, they're 5,000 pair of like really, really tiny shoes that nobody can use. So planners made decisions based on political considerations. They were often under political pressure, depending on what various ministers wanted, and past production. So this factory was able to produce X amount in the past, so they can produce X amount currently. And then input and output requirements. So what they needed and what they wanted to produce. Again, the market is not being involved here. Therefore, as they tried to deal with demand, as they tried to deal with sort of like the inefficiencies in the system and the increase in complexity, they start giving more and more specific instructions to factories. So basically, the industry becomes more and more rigid as factories can't do anything without these instructions. And then again, these instructions aren't really addressing the situation. So there is a disconnect between production and demand in the consumer sector. So even though people were wanting certain things, the people in Moscow making decisions didn't really know, because again, we're talking about a incredibly large population over a vast distances, and there's Moscow. And so they're producing things that people don't want. And then the other thing, because you have these managers in the factories producing things to meet targets rather than for demand, the items are being produced, like we have shoes that are being produced at small sizes, so people don't want them. Sometimes the quality, managers have no incentive to make sure that their factories are producing high quality goods. And so the quality may be really, really poor as long as they meet the target. And so there is some attempt at experimentation between heavy and light industry, kind of based on profit. And that came later because a Soviet economist in 1962 was like, you guys, like, this doesn't make sense, that there should be some profit in there to direct where the resources are going, especially in light industry, in the production of consumer goods. But a Soviet economy can't provide realistic prices for raw materials because it's very difficult to separate the economy, to separate heavy and light industry, since it is so centralized. And so there is some experimentation from 1962 onward trying to alleviate some of the issues within the economy. But the problem ultimately is that this centralization is built into the Soviet economy. So from the very beginning of the Soviet state, from the Bolshevik Revolution, centralization is in there. And so because, each branch of the economy was headed by a certain ministry and with ministers, and so the bureaucrats are making decisions. So being able to separate this heavy and light industry and to be able to have the economy react on profit would actually call for dismantling of the system that's in place, and that was not going to happen. And as pretty much stated before, the bureaucrats in Moscow were making irrational decisions for various reasons, but this is going to have negative impacts on the economy. So in 1957, recognizing all of this, Khrushchev gets rid of the economic ministries located in Moscow and creates more than 100 local economic councils. And these are called, and I know I'm going to sound totally native, Sovnarkozy. And the thing is that these were created for a couple of different reasons. So one, he is trying to fix some of the inefficiencies in the Soviet system, but at the same time, he is trying to take care of some of the political happenings. A lot of the people who were working against him, right, some of those anti-party people, were heads of these ministries located in Moscow. And so by doing this, he would reduce their power and increase his. And it's a twofer. Fix economic situation, fix political situation. Awesome. However, being that it's Khrushchev, and according to historian Kenneth, Khrushchev was incredibly enthusiastic, incredibly impatient, and not real thoughtful. So this shift from these to these local economic councils happened very quickly, and like within a few months. And therefore, they were insufficiently planned, insufficiently considered, didn't take into account some of the various things that could affect the, success. And basically, what you now have are local councils without national perspective. So what these local councils did is they were in charge of all of the industry within their political area. And so as a result, they have a view of their local situation, but they don't have a national perspective, kind of like an idea of what is needed over the whole of the country. And so therefore, they cannot set priorities for themselves. The result is going to be even more inefficiencies in the system. So the other thing that happens is these local councils, they don't get rid of the bureaucracy, they just create another layer of bureaucracy. And now the handling of this massive economic system is in the hands of people without national perspective who have no experience doing all of this in the provincial areas. Therefore, I think you can reach a conclusion there. Since they are only in charge, in charge of the all of the industries within their geographical limits, then that means that they are not in communication with areas that are far away, or with areas, it can be close but outside of their political boundary. Therefore, they can't receive raw materials from the other areas. So it increases more inefficiencies in the system. You don't have a unified plan. It's now decentralized to the point where it's not working either. And so now he switches the national coordination of industry into Gosplan in Moscow, but Gosplan doesn't have the mechanisms to enforce their decisions. So they can write and say whatever they want, but they can't force the provincial managers, the provincial bureaucrats, to follow along. And of course, the provincial bureaucrats have their own needs, their own local political considerations, or nepotism that they have to deal with, right? Like they have clients, or they themselves may be clients of other important people that they have to kind of address the needs of the people who put them in power and the people at the low levels who provide them with power, rather than sorting out national industry. So now you have committees are established, and these committees to try to manage cooperation between these different units. And what they do is they reduce the power of the local economic councils, and that just creates another level of bureaucracy, another level of potential inefficiency and lack of coordination. So what this actually does, the creation of these local councils created even more disruptions in a system that was already not extremely well functioning. And so after Khrushchev, they were abolished. Now these things, of course, are adding fuel to the fire of people wanting to get rid of Khrushchev. He went with the creation of these local councils, he attacked the power base of these national ministers. And that is just going to give them another reason to band together to work against Khrushchev. And so let's talk a little bit about the 7-year plan. And you're like, but Miss Michelle, I thought these plans came in 5-year increments. You would be right, except with Khrushchev. So Stalin died in the midst of the 5th 5-year plan. And so they kind of finished it a little bit. And then in 1955, they began the 6th 5-year plan. But essentially, these targets on the 6th 5-year plan were really, really super optimistic. And so they recognized that they wouldn't be able to meet those targets. And they scrapped it in 1959. And so there they began Khrushchev's 7-year plan. And the purpose of this plan was to focus on consumer goods, develop light industry, chemicals, plastics, and mineral resources like natural gas and oil and coal. And the focus was supposed to be on regional development. So the idea is that there are these portions of Russia, the western portion, the European portion of Russia, which has received the vast amount of the industrial investment. And so now they're going to try to spend more money investing in other parts of Russia. And about 40% of government investment at that time went into eastern portion of Russia. And by focusing on these different aspects of the economy, like consumer goods and chemicals and plastics, the idea is to develop a more balanced economy that can respond more readily to needs, has more to trade, etc., etc. And the goal of this 5-year plan, or the 7-year plan, I don't know numbers, was to surpass the 1958 economy by 80%. Now, this would have required a huge amount of investment by the government. And while the government did invest quite a bit, when we look at the foreign policies of Khrushchev, you'll see that the government actually is a little po. So po, they can't afford the OR. And so because there are all of these different things that the government is trying to deal with, then that means that resources are being allocated elsewhere and not fully into the 7-year plan. And again, they recognize that maybe they're not going to be able to meet everything. So in 1961, they revise it instead of the 7-year plan into the 5-year plan, the 7th 5-year plan. I know, even if you are good with numbers, this is confusing. Khrushchev did this on purpose, just to make me confused. And in the next slide, we're going to look at the results of all of this. So looking at this slide, we can see that Khrushchev didn't do that so badly. The economy grew. If we look at 1958 as what was going on at that time, let's look at producers of capital goods and consumer goods. If in 1958 that's the 100% mark, you can see in 1965, according to the plan, where they were supposed to be. And then in 1965, where they actually wound up. And for the most part, he either surpassed the targets or got super, super close. In terms of consumer goods, he increased it by 60%. That's pretty darn good. In terms of capital goods, that went up by 96%. That's pretty good. There was increased production of steel, of coal, of oil, so the exploitation of some of those mineral resources in the coal and the oil. There is a massive increase in electricity production and also in machine tools. So in a very real way, the economy improved quite a bit. And we're not actually going to see a growth like this or really like an investment in an economy like this until you get to Gorbachev. The years of Brezhnev's rule were kind of rubbish in a way, in this way. Okay. So in the midst of all of the stuff that's happening in the agricultural sector and all of the stuff that is happening in terms of creating new organs to deal with industry and all of this stuff, there were policies that worked to directly impact people's lives, the consumers and living standards of people. So one of the things that happened in September 1956 was the introduction of a minimum wage. And so this was to try to deal with some of the imbalances in terms of earning potential between urban and rural workers, and between people involved in manual jobs and professions. So trying to reduce some of the inequalities which had crept up and give people sort of like a minimum standard of life that they could afford. This was good. There was an improvement in working conditions. There was a shorter working day. More holidays were given. Longer maternity leave. Better pensions. So ultimately, there was trying to make work life better for people as well. In 1956, there was the expansion of secondary education, that is high school education for all. Now, one of the things that had happened, partly because there had been the greatest amount of investment in European Russia, this meant that in other places, especially in the Eastern republics and the places farther away from the political center, not the same amount of investment had been made in education. So now there is the expansion of education to all, and this is good for many people because this means that people in the peripheral areas now have the potential, the opportunity to get into different professional positions. So it's, in a way, an opportunity for them to rise up, even though they are in the periphery and far from the political and economic centers. there is this massive emphasis on scientific and education and technological education. And so this expansion and focus on this type of education resulted in Russia, or the Soviet Union, achieving a great number of firsts in the space race, in space exploration, like the first person in space, the first woman in space, the first living organism in space, the first satellite, etc., etc. There is this massive improvement in medical care, and the result, and that medical care means prenatal care as well as obstetric care when women are having babies, and the result is going to be a significant decline in infant mortality between 1950 and 1965. So what we're saying is a lot more babies are surviving birth and early childhood. But there's always a but. Even though Khrushchev was trying to massively improve living standards and through that quality of life, sort of like happiness that people have with their lives and their situation, disposable income during the time he was in power rose only by 4% a year. What this means is the extra money that people have to enjoy life, to go and spend on things like movies or extraneous things, was very, very small. Despite government subsidies for food, for like electricity, and for transportation, the cost of living was still very, very high. And people did not have that much left over to be able to, I don't know, buy things that make them happy. You know what I'm saying? A little retail therapy never hurt anybody. Okay, maybe it did, but retail therapy, good. And people get upset when they cannot engage in retail therapy. I'm telling you, I know this. There are studies. Actually, there are. So the other thing is, while, as we saw from the previous graph, the previous chart, there is this really huge increase in terms of the production of consumer goods. However, those consumer goods are all kinds of not good. There is a very low quality. So people, well, one, many people don't have the extra money to buy things, and the things that are available for purchase are rubbish. And so these shortages continued, largely because Khrushchev would sometimes get a bee in his bonnet, and he was constantly shifting his focus, and that meant that government investment also shifted, resulting in inefficiencies and shortages in other parts of the economy. So by the time he's overthrown in 1964, only 5 in 1,000 people, citizens, owned a car. 82 per 1,000 had a TV. I know, you cannot even imagine. You're like, what? How do people live? Exactly. And only 40 in 1,000 owned a refrigerator. And think about what a refrigerator affords you, allows you to do. But only 0.04% of the population could actually afford to purchase a refrigerator. And ultimately, even though, like I said, he was always trying to improve the living standards, he failed to do this in a significantly spectacular enough way. The economy did grow, but there are buts. And there is no improvement in efficiency. There is not enough improvement in productivity. As a matter of fact, there was a lot lost to the system because of the inefficiencies that he created. And this is going to help lead to increasing the amount of opposition to his rule until he's overthrown in 1964. So we've talked about sort of like a triumvirate of things that help lead to his overthrow: political, economic, and then later on we will talk about foreign policy. Which brings us to the Khrushchev Surprise! So, Khrushchev, surrounded by his aides and bodyguards, surveys an art exhibition. "What the hell is this green circle with yellow spots all over?" he asked. His aide answers, "This painting, Comrade Khrushchev, depicts our heroic peasants fighting for the fulfillment of the plan to produce 200 million tons of grain." "Ah. And what is this black triangle with red strips?" "This painting Shows our heroic industrial workers in a factory. And what is this fat ass with ears? Comrade Khrushchev, this is not a painting. This is a mirror. That was a Khrushchev joke. I did not write it. This is just one of those things that was going about during his rule. Again, helping to indicate how people perceived him.